The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Repro Action's monthly Act and Learn webinar for August 2019. Tonight's topic is an incredibly important one for reproductive justice and social justice. It is incarceration and reproductive oppression. So first we'll introduce with our host. This first voice you're hearing is the woman on your left. It's Erin Matson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and you can find me on Twitter at Erin to the Max.
And the second voice you're hearing is Pamela Merritt. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Repro Action, and you can follow me on Twitter at SharkFood. So the agenda for tonight will begin with an introduction of Repro Action for people who are new to our webinars, and then a presentation by Caitlin Blenny, who is our organizing lead on incarceration and reproductive oppression, followed by our panel discussion, which will kick off with Eva Pierre, Esquire, litigation counsel for If, When, How, Crystal Hayes, MSW social work doctoral candidate, and Kimberly Haven of Reproductive Justice Inside in NARAL Pro-Choice, Maryland. Then we'll go through some next steps in housekeeping, and then there will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you have questions, you can drop them into the question tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A. The hashtag for tonight is Repro Action. Repro Action leads bold, direct action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis, our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition, and our commitment to nonviolent direct action. And with that, I'll hand it over to Caitlin.
Whoops, was muted. Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Blenny. I am the organizing lead here at Reproaction. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Alexandria, Virginia. So I just wanted to top line a little bit about mass incarceration and who is behind bars in the US before we get started with tonight's webinar. So the United States is the largest, has the largest prison population in the world. Right now there are 2.3 million people behind bars. And despite declining between 2010 and 2013, the US's prison and jail population has continued to increase every year since. Right now, there are more jails than colleges in the US, and nearly every single one of the 2.3 million people in jails, prisons, and detention centers come from poor and working class backgrounds. We know that from studies and research that poverty can exacerbate and increase crime because people are forced to find alternative methods of survival under capitalism. Women are also the fastest growing segment in the incarcerated population. There are more than 8 times as many women incarcerated today as there were in 1980, and 2/3 of the women behind bars are women of color. We also know that the rates in which white women are being sent to jail is increasing, likely due to the opioid epidemic. There are also 2.7 million children in the US who have a parent behind bars. Black folks are 5 times more likely than their white counterparts to end up in jail, and almost half of all Black adult women in the US have a family member who is locked up. We also know that LGBTQ folks are more likely to be held in solitary confinement than the general population, and at least 80,000 people at any given time are resigned to solitary. In the long term, for folks who don't know, solitary confinement is extremely expensive and does absolutely nothing to rehabilitate people. It is often known to exacerbate mental illness or even cause it in prisoners who were otherwise healthy. And for folks who don't know anything about solitary, people can be left alone between 22 to 24 hours a day with little to no human contact in a very small space. The last point that we'll make before the next slide here is that prisoners today are paid less per hour than they were in 2001. And there are still a number of states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, and Texas, that do not pay their inmates for their labor, We also know that states rely on their prison population for labor when they need it. Last year, we saw California using their prison population, paying prisoners $2 a day to fight wildfires, jobs in which they were barred from getting post-incarceration because of criminal histories. So I wanted to top line just some of the things that have fueled mass incarceration historically. Today, we have an incredible panel who will be talking about what's happening today, but I just wanted to go over a few of these. This is in no way an exhaustive list. Historically, and it continues today, prisons have always been a place where we send people deemed undesirable. So people have gone to jail in the past for their gender and sexual identity, for their immigration status, or even if they're just a person of color. Many scholars, activists, and prisoners have linked the exemption clause from the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, to the rise of the prison industrial complex. That clause says that nobody can be enslaved except for punishment of a crime, and many believe this is how the prison system has been created in such a way that it incarcerates Black people at 5 times the rate of white people. Historically, there are a number of policies that are racist that have fueled incarceration. The first one we're going to mention is Black codes and vagrancy laws, which were restrictive laws that were designed to limit the freedom of African Americans post-slavery. Under Black codes, many states required that Black folks sign yearly labor contracts, and if they refused, they risked arrest. Often, if they refused, they could also risk being fined or being forced into unpaid labor either way. There were also vagrancy laws, which criminalized unemployment and helped Southern state populations explode. A great example is Alabama. In 1850, 99% of prisoners were white, and 20 years later, by 1870, 85% were Black. As in response to this, the federal government added the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which helped solve some of these problems. But by the end of Reconstructionalism, Jim Crow laws formed the same function as Black codes did. It became a crime to do things that people could do every day and in no way wrong or dangerous. It was a crime to walk along a railroad line, to sell the produce from your farm after dark, and to speak loudly in the company of a white person. Both of these things help form the idea of Black criminality, this idea that Black people are inherently more dangerous because they're overrepresented in the prison system, instead of seeing that system as a system that was created in that way to imprison them. We continue to enact policies. I think a pretty common one that we're familiar with is the war on drugs, which was a campaign by the US government under the Nixon administration, where arrests focused predominantly on Black folks who were sent to state prisons for drug offenses 13 times more often than other races, despite only making up 13% of regular drug users. In the 1980s, the number of arrests for all crimes had increased by 28%, but the number of arrests for drug offenses rose to 126%. The result and increased demand for prison spaces also helped what we're now dealing with, which is the privatization and the for-profit prison industry. While the money used to imprison people could instead be used to help communities thrive, underneath incarceration, we see a historical need of using prisoners for cheap or free labor, which brings us to our next point. Historically, prisoners were held in jail, but eventually they ran out of space. States realized that instead of building large facilities, they could turn prisoners over to companies and people who needed a large number of laborers, and have those companies essentially create labor camps and house and feed inmates for them to work. As a result, inmates faced awful, horrific conditions, often starving, just really awful, working long hours, things along that line. And this convict leasing system impacted thousands of Black men in the South. The last thing that I want to touch on is the role of prosecutors and how they drive mass incarceration today. To a certain degree, district attorneys have a ton of power. They have the police on their side and the ability to decide if and how they will prosecute crimes. They also have the power to recommend sentences and offer plea bargains. Despite crime dropping in the US, the homicide rate is actually lower now than it was in the 1970s. And in the 90s and the 2000s, arrests for serious and violent crimes dropped by 20%. Despite all of that, more people are being sentenced to prison time. This could be a result of the tough-on-crime culture of the 90s that resulted in the hiring of 10,000 plus prosecutors across the country. With all of these new prosecutors, they were able to handle a larger caseload, which of course translates to more people being sentenced to jail. Over time, many states also made district attorneys electable positions, and being seen as tough on crime was often seen as a good thing for people's political career. Often district attorney was seen as the first step in doing so. In addition to that, fear of crime has been driving our policies. We see this on the war on drugs, but it also drives prosecutors to put more people in jail. The fear of letting crimes fall through the cracks and that reflecting poorly and not translating into a re-election is a genuine fear. And prosecutors don't want to be second guessed by allowing someone who may go commit crime or be labeled as weak on crime themselves. The last point I'll make before we dive into our panelists conversation, I just want to take a second to acknowledge that we know that prison and immigration detention centers are the sites of sexual violence that inherently deny people their right to bodily and reproductive autonomy and freedom. Throughout this webinar, you're going to hear from 3 really incredible panelists that we are so thankful to have with us. But just note that we'll likely not be able to touch on anything. And as mentioned before, we encourage you to use the question box.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. So I have the pleasure of introducing Eva Pierre, who uses she, her pronouns. And Eva is the litigation counsel for If, When, How, where she litigates civil and criminal defense cases. She is a former public defender who is committed to transforming legal systems. Her goal is to move power from oppressive systems to those they seek to oppress. She is a Haitian-born, Florida-raised New York transplant who is committed to raging against the dying of the light. Welcome, Eva.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
Real well, thank you so much. So let's dive on in. So people are already being unjustly jailed for abortion and other pregnancy outcomes, especially for self-managed abortion, which is abortion that is managed outside of a medical setting. Could you talk about why and how this is happening?
Sure. So I think it's to contextualize it, we gotta start thinking about what landscape we're finding ourselves in, right? So since about 2010, politicians have passed over 300 restrictions on abortions. Those are restrictions that make it unaffordable and inaccessible for some people to be able to access abortion across the United States, which jeopardizes their health and their well-being. And these restrictions they disproportionately impact people of color, folks that reside in low-income communities, and these are folks that are already over-policed, right, and have a much larger police presence within their communities. There are folks that are closer to criminalization, right, because of the identities that they have on a whole. And there are folks that we're squeezing options away from. And if you're of the belief that I am, that people should be able to have the abortion that they want to have, whether that's a clinical abortion inside of a hospital or a clinic, or whether that's an abortion in the privacy of their own home, it changes folks' ability to be able to do that when there are these restrictions. Some of those restrictions are things that bring folks closer to criminalization. And, you know, I've heard from people sometimes that can we hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Everyone dismissed all of the brilliance I said into.
Oh, no.
I'm kidding. I said nothing. What I was going to say though is I've heard from folks that maybe these restrictions, particularly around self-managed abortion, are to protect people, right? And they're usually thinking about medication abortion when they say this. But the reality is that abortion pills have been used for about 20 years in clinics, by healthcare providers, and it's FDA approved, and it's a safe and effective method of terminating someone's pregnancy. So these are not laws that are created for safety of communities. It's laws for oppressing communities, right? And the greatest threat to people who self-manage their abortions is not their health and safety of being able to use medication abortion, but it's threats of prosecution, threats of politically motivated and unnecessary policies. It's over-policing, it's systemic racism. So the question of kind of why is this happening? It's this cauldron of years of laws and policies that are set up to really remove folks' access to having the abortion that they want to have, and to attach that label of criminalization to folks that they consider other or not worthy, right, or less than. And that's really why we find ourselves looking at folks passing laws in such abundance to restrict access to abortion.
Right, got it. Thank you for that. So what role do prosecutors play in mass incarceration and in punishing people for their pregnancy outcomes?
So I like to talk about the people you meet along the way in a criminal case, right? So your first stop is a cop, right? So a police officer can exercise their discretion to arrest or not arrest, but they have nothing written that say, you know what, you don't have to do this. If everything meets the checkbox, then a police officer arrests you, right? Because it's probable cause. Probable cause is not this really high burden that they need to meet. And then you meet the prosecutor. And the prosecutor is really the first actor that holds all of the power in this criminal case, that can look at something and say, you know what, I don't have enough here to show that somebody has committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So that's kind of their first power, the discretion to choose, do I bring this case? Does this need to move forward? They're supposed to serve as this checks and balances against these police powers, right? Because the Supreme Court has already told us that police officers do not need to know the law, but prosecutors do. They're lawyers, they have to know the law, they have to know whether or not a crime has actually been committed. But let's say the laws on the books, we just talked about these, hundreds of restrictions, all of these criminalization laws. Let's say they come across a case that on the black letter of the law, they can move forward. They also have the discretion to ask themselves, do I? Mm-hmm. Does this prosecution benefit society as a whole, right? Or they have the discretion to say, okay, what plea bargain can I offer? Is this something where someone needs to have a criminal record at the end of this? What are the collateral consequences that might affect someone? And what I hear oftentimes when I say things like this is from prosecutors, they'll say, well, I'm not a defense attorney. I don't represent your client. You do that. That's your job. But the reality is the prosecutor is supposed to represent the state, right? And by the state, they're not talking about the state of New York, California, Virginia. They mean the people within their jurisdiction. And I think what happens is prosecutors forget that the accused is also a person within their jurisdiction that they need to care about. So they're basically the road signs along the way to mass incarceration. And they have the power to say stop. They have the power to say yield, right? And they're the ones that are guiding this path.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. That is just, I think a lot of people aren't aware of that much power.
Yeah, and and it's also a tempered power. If you're a brand new, fresh out of law school line prosecutor, honestly, you don't really have that much power. When the cases come, you have a supervisor, your supervisor has a supervisor, and then they answer to the elected official. And that's really where we as people have a ton of power. because we have a lot of people that call themselves progressive prosecutors now. That's kind of a buzzword we hear a lot. And we have the power to hold those people accountable to the things that they promise us when they're running, right? We have the power to show up to those elections when they are running. People tend not to. They're like the off-time elections, right? Like we can say who holds this office and what policies do they follow. And when they say this is what we're gonna do, we can show up to court and sit down and watch them and make sure they actually hold their line prosecutors to that standard.
That is, we are all about accountability at Repro Action, so I love to hear that. Very quickly, because we're at time, but I didn't want to skip the question about pretrial incarceration. As a St. Louisan, we have a long and horrific history with the workhouse here with people who have been incarcerated for years waiting trial. So why does this problem exist, and what can we do to address it?
The big answer is poverty. So pretrial incarceration is what happens in jails when people are held before they're ever found guilty of a crime. I've had cases where people are held, like what you said, for quite some time, and then their case gets dismissed, or there's a plea bargain where they get time, the time in that they serve, sometimes which is more than what the maximum time that they could have gotten on a case. So one of the main reasons that people are held in pretrial incarceration is they cannot afford bail. And sometimes it's a very small amount, and their family members, they're not in a position to be able to pay that bail. And sometimes, there are bail funds that might be able to pay bail for people, but there are even restrictions around that, such as you can't bail someone out with a bail fund for a felony, even if it's less than what it would have been for a misdemeanor. So in essence, we have people held in cages and asking them to buy their freedom. It's very reminiscent of the old South in that way. But what can we do to address it? Well, I would say donate to your local bail fund, and also court watch. Show up to court, sit in the courtrooms, and make those judges look at you when they actually give bail on a case. Hold them accountable, talk about it, tweet about it, and also vote them out. If plenty of judges are elected, and if they continuously set high bails, low bails, or bail on cases where people are not a danger to society, they should no longer hold that job.
Hear, hear. Eva, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Erin, but please hold on, Eva, because I know there's going to be questions at the end. Thank you so much. Erin?
All right, thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Eva. So I'm very pleased to introduce Crystal Hayes, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut School for Social Work. She's a social work educator, organizer, advocate, and reproductive justice scholar whose work has been featured in Ms. Magazine, Huffington Post, and MSNBC's The Griot, and other media outlets and academic publications. Her work as a reproductive justice activist and scholar is deeply rooted in the Audre Lorde quote that, quote, "your silence will not protect you," unquote. She applies this mantra every day to fight for freedom and liberation for incarcerated Black women and other women of color and their children as a reproductive and human rights issue. Crystal, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and we're so glad you're here. Thank you. So,
Thank you.
Help paint the picture for us. We just got some incredible context from Caitlin at Repro Action, Eva at If, When, How. At the ground level, what is picture prison like for pregnant people?
So thank you for that question. I think, first of all, it's really important for us to distinguish what we mean by prison and jail, because the vast majority of folks are actually in our jail system and not our prison system. So first, I want to start off by saying, correctional institutions come with similar and different set of reproductive politics and challenges. And I know the conversation that we're having tonight, we want to think about what does reproduction look like in our prisons. So for example, while jails and prisons have similar features and that both are designed to strip you of your freedom, jails and prisons differ in how long you lose your freedom. So really one of the primary distinctions between the two is length of stay. Jails are meant to hold people awaiting trial and those convicted of minor offenses with shorter periods of time. Prisons are designed to incarcerate people convicted of felonies and sentenced to long-term imprisonment, which can be anywhere from a year to a life sentence, right? So unfortunately, there is data to suggest, though, that sentences have increased across the board for people who are imprisoned in both jails and prisons. And so this has major implications for reproductive justice issues and for my work, especially for people in local county jails, which are typically not equipped or set up to maintain people for longer periods of time, even though we know that people are being housed in our local county jails for longer periods of time, years on end, for that matter. And that all of these institutions, for the most part, fall grossly short of adequately meeting the reproductive health care needs of people who are incarcerated there. They may struggle in how they differ to meet those needs, but for the most part, they all fall short of meeting those needs. And so the other thing I want to say about this is that these differences are important because they govern and I think they dictate how these different institutions operate, the kind of funding sources that they have access to, and resources and program and services that are made available to those people who are confined to them, right? So when someone is confined and sentenced for an extended period of time, over several months, years, or even decades, the time away from their children and families can sever really important parent-child relationships and other familial bonds that are important for us to be thinking about. They can rob people of creating family and raising children, and even destroy entire communities for generations. When someone is detained in a local jail for years sometimes, without even being indicted of a crime, let alone convicted of a crime, because they cannot post bail, as is common in a lot of states, there can be an even heavier burden for those folks because they lack the sort of infrastructures that prisons have to care for people's reproductive health care and their needs. And I also want to also be really clear that I don't think we should be locking people up in cages across the board, but particularly for women and girls, it really is an act of violence to lock up women and girls in these cages, especially when we consider the fact that the vast majority, over 90% of those who are incarcerated, have a history of some kind of violent trauma. Most women who are incarcerated, the pathway to incarceration for women and girls is sexual trauma, substance abuse and neglect. The vast majority of them are there for nonviolent offenses. And then once there, those institutions are not equipped to care for their pregnant bodies. They're not equipped to care for their reproductive health needs. And so we need to be thinking about mass incarceration, I think more broadly, as an act of sterilization or a tool of sterilization for all people, particularly for women and girls.
Wow, that is profound about mass incarceration as a tool of sterilization. So you mentioned reproductive health care access being inadequate, to put it mildly, within prisons as well as jails. Can you share some more? What does reproductive health care access look like inside prisons? So I'm talking about everything from childbirth to services, whether I'm talking about abortion or contraception or STI treatment and other things that people need.
So I just want to reiterate my point about mass incarceration as a tool of sterilization. I sort of arrived at this reality during my dissertation data collection. So I'm currently in the throes of interviewing formerly incarcerated women about their pregnancy and childbirth experiences behind bars. And when you say what is it like for incarcerated people, it is an absolute nightmare. The stories that I'm getting from these people are absolutely horrendous. It's really painful to listen to the level of disrespect, the kinds of violence that a lot of people have to survive just trying to get access to basic health care, like make an appointment to have an abortion, or see a doctor for the first time because you're pregnant. We know that prisoners in the United States are the only group of people who have a constitutionally protected right to health care. There have been all kinds of class action lawsuits, Supreme Court cases that basically said if you're going to incarcerate people, then we have to make sure that they have access to appropriate health care. And so in theory, that makes a lot of sense, but in practice, we know that that's not happening. And that's true for all kinds of health care. You have people who are suffering from chronic diseases and illnesses that are not getting adequate treatment. But for pregnant people, everything from making an appointment to see a prenatal doctor, making an appointment to have an abortion, being treated for some kind of pre-existing condition that may be life-threatening for you or your child is really difficult to receive. And so the women that I'm interviewing are constantly sharing stories with me about not seeing doctors, even when they say they need to see one, they're in pain or they're bleeding or there's some other kind of complication, or they see doctors maybe once or twice throughout their entire incarceration before the delivery. Many don't even receive the due date for their babies. They might get an approximate due date, but not the exact due date, because most institutions use that as a tool to control people, right? And so there's also this language around it being a safety concern, so that people don't want you to be able to tell your friends and family when you'll be at the hospital, when you're going to deliver, because it might be some kind of safety issue. Basic things like having enough food to eat. I worked with the Prison Birth Project in Western Massachusetts, and we were going inside of the local women's jail there to do childbirth education classes. And the staff who went in to conduct those classes would often come back to our meetings and say, the mamas are complaining about being hungry. So we would try to make sure that we would bring in extra food, once a week while we were there, so that they could have, a treat or something that they were craving, or just have enough nutrition for that day. And I can tell you that those stories are consistent with the stories that I've been collecting during my dissertation research.
Thank you so much, Crystal. This is extremely disturbing, and thank you for your research and your work and for sharing this with our guests tonight. I want to encourage everyone with questions for Crystal or any of our panelists to put them into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. And with that, I will pass it back to Pamela.
Thank you so much, Erin. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kimberly Haven, who uses she, her pronouns, is the Coalition and Policy Director for Reproductive Justice Inside. She is a thought leader and a powerful voice and force in the new social justice movement. Kim has an extensive background in community organizing, creating advocacy campaigns, and leading legislative campaigns. She is uniquely familiar with the criminal justice system and is adept at organizing in that space. She has a strong passion for reproductive justice issues and is committed to reforming the negative conditions of confinement. She has the unique distinction of being the only formerly incarcerated individual who has written and gotten passed legislation on both the state and city levels. Ms. Haven speaks with a fresh voice, insight, and authority that brings new attention to the gender disparities in criminal justice system. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you. Thank you. So glad to be here tonight. This has been really informative and interesting.
I'm so glad that, and I know that this section is going to be equally so. So let's jump right in. What are some of the challenges that people face post-incarceration?
Well, I think that kind of harkening back to the other two panelists as well, is that we seem to lose sight, we as a society seem to lose sight of the fact that 95% of the people that we incarcerate come home. And I say this literally almost on a daily basis here in the work that I do in Maryland, that what we do to people that we incarcerate, and certainly what we don't do for or with them, is what they bring home to the communities. So when somebody is coming out of jail or prison, they're starting their lives all over again. And so there is this snowball that becomes an avalanche that's hanging over the top of your head. So you now have to think about, how do I find a job? How do I find a job without an address? How do I find an address? How do I find a place I can lay my head when I don't have a job? And then 4 hours after I get home, I have to go see my parole agent, and I have to pay $45 that I don't have. And so it's this constant state of you're not even able to catch up. You are dancing as fast as you possibly can, and everything that you went through when you're on the inside is what you've also brought back to the community without the supports to be able to navigate it, to be able to manage it, and to be able to get connected where you need to be connected in order to regain your life.
Yeah, wow. I mean, when you think about all of that crushing pressure and time-sensitive pressure, it's really quite daunting. Could you talk specifically about the work that Reproductive Justice Inside is doing in Maryland?
Yeah, we were convened 3 years ago by Neighborhood Choice Maryland to look at the reproductive health issues of incarcerated women and girls in Maryland. And so we started with town hall forums, trying to engage women and hear their stories. What was interesting was because I knew the stories, and so we were able to shape a really robust legislative agenda. And I will tell you that in the 3 years that are forming, we've gotten 3 significant bills passed. Some of them have positioned Maryland to be the first in the nation. So we're working on access to reproductive health care. And we started with anti-shackled legislation, so that women who are pregnant from the moment a woman is confirmed pregnant, all the way through at least 8 weeks post-pregnancy, postpartum, that she cannot be shackled at our state level. Unfortunately, I am finding out that at our local level, that is still going on. And so we need to work on that. We passed a menstrual hygiene product bill at both state and all of our county facilities. And then we also did a pregnancy policy. So we mandated that every institution where women and girls are detained, whether it's trial or whether they're sentenced, had to provide a policy on their pregnant and their pregnant women healthcare policies. And what we found there was that most of them didn't have a policy. And so we spent last year crafting what we believe will be nationally recognized model policy that hopefully we will be able to get across the country. And then this past year, I actually wrote a bill that ended the practice of placing women involuntarily, which was the practice in Maryland, in restricted housing or solitary confinement. So from the moment that a woman is confirmed pregnant, she cannot be placed in restricted housing. Our policy was in Maryland that 6 to 8 weeks before her due date would be removed from general population and placed in, they called medical infirmary, but the way that it is set up and the way that it is used was in fact restrictive housing. She was confined 22 hours a day or more in her cell. There's no natural light, no movement, her programming stops. There's, I'm not even going to talk about the lack of nutritional food or quality food, but it also removed her from the social supports and social network that all women kind of create for themselves within the prison and jail setting. And so she was basically being punished for being pregnant. And so I wrote the bill last year. It was passed without any kind of argument or opposition, and we became the first in the nation to do that. This year, we're now looking at menstrual equity for all legislation, which would impact my folks. I talk about my folks because I have been inside. And so all of the places that my folks go, so whether it's social services, whether it's parole and probation, whether it's the courthouse, city hall, wherever it is, we need to make sure that menstrual hygiene products are freely available to women and also to girls. So we'll be working on legislation that will make it available in public schools. We're also looking at emergency contraception. we know, and I think that Crystal touched on this in the people that she talks to, that within 5 days of being arrested, she's had unprotected sex. And I know that when they go home, because I also do interviews with people when they're leaving, and I'll always say to them, what's the first thing you're going to do to go home? It is 90% of the time, have sex with my boyfriend and eat at Red Lobster. I do not know why people go to Red Lobster, but okay. But they can't afford a $50 emergency contraception. And so what you want is, if you can give them a pregnancy test when they come in, you also need to be able to say, are you interested in an emergency contraception? And when they leave, are you planning on becoming pregnant this year? No. Are you interested in emergency contraception? And we need to make that available. And so that's kind of what we're looking at for Maryland for 2020, but also thinking larger on 2021, because as I said, the legislation that we passed, we now need to make sure is being implemented. And sadly, we know that, you know, we can't fight things that we don't see, and we can't see the things they don't tell us. So administration will tell me one thing, people that are on the inside or just coming out will tell me one thing, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. And so we need to really push for transparency and accountability.
That is an amazing list of proactive and amazing policy. So the first thing that came to my head was, you know, my gosh, what is happening in my home state, in my turf? And I'm sure other people who are listening to this webinar are thinking the same thing. How can people learn about what's happening in their state, and in the interest of not recreating the wheel, tap into activism that's currently going on?
Well, and I think that's the biggest thing. There, every state level, because I talk to counterparts across the country, that there is movement around this. Some of them are just starting with menstrual hygiene legislation. Some are still working on shackling. But there are people on the ground, advocacy organizations working on these very issues, and why it's so important. Women have become correctional afterthoughts. And so you can find that space and people that are working in that space by just reaching out. Also, as you said, let's not recreate a wheel. There are people like me who have done in every state, and we are more than happy and more than willing to not only share our best practices and the things that we've done, and also our lessons learned. Let's face it, you know, these states are not without lumps and bruises. We're happy to share all of that and also connect people. And so, you know, I make myself available all the time to anybody who wants to understand what's going on with this population, why this issue is so important, and connect them where I can and where I can so that they can get involved, build that national voice so that women are not correctional afterthoughts anymore.
That is just a great bit of advice as far as, you know, getting started and making sure that you're supporting existing work. So I'm also thinking in terms of if people do identify a need and a gap, what can activists do to ensure that people in prisons have access to reproductive health care and menstrual products and nutrition?
Well, I'll tell you that the way that we started, we were kind of in a different position because I already knew what was going on behind the walls. And so when I was asked, it was like, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that. Oh yeah, no, we're not getting that. In every state, there is a group of people that have been formerly incarcerated that maintain those ties and maintain those connects behind the wall. And in order to understand what's really going on, you have to engage those folks. You have to create a safe space where they can share that story. And you also have to realize that that's one version, like I said, they'll tell me one side and administration will tell me something else. We've had to file PIAs in order to make them report things out. And again, in that I don't believe. I'll just be real honest. It's my prison cynical viewpoint of some of this stuff. But I also have learned how to work through my legislators. And so you can work through the committees. If there's something that you want to know, you find somebody on one of your budget and taxation committees and say, listen, can you make them report out on this? And more than likely they will do that. Find a legislator who is pro-choice, who is I don't want to say criminal because I get accused of being all the time, but who is interested in reform issues, particularly as it relates to women, because the drivers of incarceration for women are very different than what the drivers are for men. Reentry for women is different than men. And so there are legislators who are looking at those very things. And those are people you can go to and just say, listen, I'm really concerned. I need to know. I'd like to know. And if there's not something that puts in place that this is not something that can be changed, how do we put a bill in place? How do we make sure that women are protected?
Fantastic advice. Kimberly, thank you so much for your work and for this insight and advice. If you will hold on, I know we have questions for you. So I am going to mute you again and then pass it over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Kimberly, and thank you to all of our panelists. This has been an information-packed and deeply upsetting webinar, but information is power, and I know that it's important to empower ourselves with information so we can fight for sustained change. I want to encourage everyone to plug into Repro Action and our work. If you sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org, we actually run these Act and Learn webinars every single month, and they're free and open to the public. If you sign up for our email list, I promise you'll never miss an invitation. I also encourage you to follow us on social media. We are Repro Action on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And also encourage you to save the date for next month's webinar. Our topic will be very different, laughing to cope, comedy and reproductive justice. So that should be a good way to let off some steam and learn more about that. That will be taking place on Wednesday, September 11th from 7 to 8 Eastern time. So please do mark your calendar and plan to join us. If you sign up at reproaction.com, I promise you won't miss the invite. We want you there. So with that, I will pass it back to Pamela to do lead Q&A with our panelists. Pamela.
Thank you very much. I have unmuted our awesome panelists, and now I get to work through your fantastic questions. The first question is for everybody, and I think we'll start with Crystal and then work our way through. What is the impact, what impact does prison have, or jail have, on women and their families?
So hi again, thank you. So most people who know me know that I'm the child of an incarcerated parent. My father was in prison for 45 years. He came home last year in his 45th year. And so I can tell you just from personal experiences that the impact is devastating. Prison is designed to destroy love, to kill love, is designed to destroy families. I don't really have any, fast, quick, easy answers for this particular question, because honestly, I'm still unpacking that for myself and my own family. But what I can say is, having talked to lots of formerly incarcerated women who were the primary caretakers of their children and sole providers of their children before their arrest and incarceration, that is devastating. You lose, sometimes more often than not, you lose your children to the system, which was the case for me and my brother. We were in foster care for a number of years during my dad's incarceration. And that's true for a lot of the women that I've talked to. Their kids are either in foster care or they're with a relative. And so, as the other panelists mentioned, 95% of the people who go to jail and prison do come home. And when they come home, they're really having to figure out how to put their lives back together. But when folks come home from prison, it doesn't stop, right? So there are over 40,000 laws that make it difficult for people to re-enter society as contributing citizens and members of their community. Everything from housing, jobs, where you can live, being eligible eligible for federal aid to go to school is either completely eliminated for you or heavily restricted. And so it makes it difficult for people to figure out how to return back to their families and their communities. So again, I don't have any quick and easy answers for that. I'll just say that it's difficult, it's devastating. People are figuring it out. One of the things that I have been excited to see in my work is a lot of formerly incarcerated women, particularly women of color, Black women and other women of color, they're coming home and they're creating support and community groups among themselves to help figure out between themselves how to support one another and how to re-enter their community with their families.
That is the kind of grassroots organizing that I just love to hear about. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing your insights of your personal experience as well. Kimberly or Eva?
Well, I will tell you that I've been home for a couple of years now, and I'm still not home. It is a very long road, and honestly, there are still triggers. I was at a federal hearing on incarcerated pregnant women that Representative Bass held, and my good friend Piper Herman was there, and they showed a scene from Orange is the New Black. And I was there with one of my coalition members who had been pregnant while she was on the inside. And the scene that they showed was when the woman was coming back after giving birth, and the way the women reacted to her. And I literally lost my mind because I'd seen that play out all of the time. I saw women coming back from their visit. I've seen women, come back after giving birth and not knowing where their child went. And it was gut-wrenching. And so this is years, a couple of years past me coming home. It doesn't take much to be snapped back. And so, like Crystal said, it is a lot to unpack. It's a very difficult thing to unpack. You can lose, and I have lost everything. And so you literally are starting off all over again from ground zero with nothing, behind the 8 ball. And then you have all of the stigma that our society places on people that have criminal records or had some sort of involvement with the criminal justice system. So you have that added to it, and it just becomes this perpetual growing avalanche that at any given moment you can't even pull a snowflake out because you're so afraid the whole thing will come crashing down on you, and you go back to prison.
Yeah, thank you. It's just huge in scope. So I actually want to move on to the next question. And this one is actually for Eva. So in thinking about restorative justice, and the questioner specifically asked, are there pieces of legislation or policy or are people advocating for policy that would center people of color who have been criminalized for self-managing or their abortions? And there was a addition, like something like maybe restoring rights and access based on what Kimberly was sharing and what Crystal shared, and then even as far as maybe expunging records.
So off the top of my head, as far as legislation, I can't really think of anything that's kind of coming down the pike or is currently active, but I think a lot of the policy focus is on getting rid of the laws that allow for criminalization, right? So thinking about restorative justice as a tool for this, it's almost as if, right, the state is the one that has done the big bad, so you would need to be restored by the state. And I think a lot of this this aspect of like expunging records, a lot of records need to be expunged. A lot of folks have been arrested for things that are not criminalized now or not look the same now. And like everyone else has kind of mentioned, the vast majority of folks that are incarcerated at some point will come back home. And a lot of folks come back home with restrictions, right? So we one of the ways that I can think about is kind of rethinking what those restrictions are, rethinking how do we allow folks to get to their best yes, how do we allow folks to do just what they want to do, right, which is just go back and have access to their families. How do we allow folks to live their lives without an aspect of their parole saying who they're allowed to associate with and when and how. I feel like I didn't really get into the question, but I think right now a lot of the focus that I would like to see is less things made illegal, specifically when it comes to reproductive justice and reproductive access.
Thank you for that. My next question is, in advancing anti-shackling legislation, this will start with Kimberly, and other reforms to increase access to reproductive health for women and people who are incarcerated, do you find that there is bipartisan support?
Yes. I think that the biggest barrier to that, however, is letting the women that are inside know what their rights are. So for instance, Maryland, abortion is a protected right, and no one allows the women no one tells the women that she has the right. And so women will say, I know I'm property when I'm incarcerated, I'm state property, therefore I can't have an abortion. We need to let them know what their rights are. And at the same time, the same holds true with our legislators. And so we need to, work both sides of the aisle on this, because at the end of the day, if we frame it from a reproductive justice lens and a dignity lens, we get it. Unless they're staunchly, the father of 9 children, and I'm not going to call any of my legislators by name, but he's there. And so you do have to, it's all in the messaging and what it is that you're trying to do.
Got it. Thank you. So the next question is about the how people encounter the system if they are trans, and is any of this work being done centering trans folk who might be incarcerated in a male prison system? Want to start with Crystal?
So I know that there's some really powerful work happening around the country. I can't speak to specific cases. I know that I can talk about our personal experiences in Western Mass. We were an advocacy organization, a grassroots organization that said we wanted to work directly with trans people as well, but we were never referred to them. And I think one of the major barriers to that had to do with so often trans people are misgendered in the criminal justice system. And so if you're misgendered when you enter the system, then the likelihood that you would be referred to an organization that specifically works with pregnant people is pretty low. So I think that has to be addressed. And I know that there are people who are doing some really powerful organizing around the country to address that.
Thank you. Kimberly?
I agree. I think that exactly what Crystal said, there is some powerful stuff happening around the country, and I think that advocates would be wise to reach out and follow their playbooks. Currently in Maryland, we don't have an aggressive or robust campaign in play right now, which kind of saddens me. But I do think that there are folks that are trying to figure out how to plug into the national landscape, and I would encourage people to do the same thing in their states.
Thank you. And Eva, did you want to weigh in as well?
I think it's already incredibly difficult for folks who ID as trans when they are criminalized, especially considering that trans folks in our communities are over-policed and over-criminalized at a much higher rate than folks that are cisgendered, and particularly already very difficult when somebody is pregnant and trans. Actually, I remember talking about this with Crystal a few months back when we first met one another about how we collect data, right? And how the data provided by facilities, particularly when somebody is misgendered, allows this intentional erasure by systems of people's identities. So we might have cases of folks that are trans and are pregnant that we never hear about because of the way these facilities collect data, the facilities that bother to collect data and share it with us without needing a FOIL or a subpoena. And it's this intentional erasure, which is another aspect of criminalization and incarceration, this taking away of identity, this turning people into numbers. And yeah.
Thank you for that. That is terrifying. And I just want to clarify what I said earlier, that obviously in any jail system or prison system that a trans person is incarcerated in is going to be fraught with a lot of misgendering, obviously, and abuse. We are at time. So I cannot thank y'all enough. I want to specifically thank our organizing lead, Caitlin Blenny, for doing a remarkable job organizing this webinar. I also want to thank our panelists, Eva, Crystal, and Kimberly, and also to thank my partner in justice, Erin Matson, for being an awesome co-host. I regret that we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but we try to be very respectful of time here at Repro Action, so we are going to close the webinar now. Thank you, everybody. You can follow us at Repro Action. There are some great tweets out there from this webinar, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.